Good evening. I'm Christina Broderick, Program Committee Co-Chair for the League of Women Voters of Greenwich. Thank you so much for joining us. The League of Women Voters is a membership organization which works to empower voters. We believe in the freedom to vote. The freedom to vote is a nonpartisan issue, and we envision a democracy where every person has the desire, the right, the knowledge, and the ability to participate. On behalf of the League of Women Voters, I would like to welcome you to a discussion with Greenwich local David Lehman, former Senior Economic Advisor to Governor Lamont and Commissioner of the Connecticut Department of Economic and Community Development. The DECD is the state agency that oversees programs promoting business growth, brownfield redevelopment, the arts, historic preservation, and tourism. Over the course of the next hour, David will discuss what strategies and steps are being pursued to attract business to Connecticut, retain and support existing Connecticut businesses, and keep and employ talented graduates of local universities at Connecticut companies and startups. During his tenure in Hartford, David worked at creating an innovative public-private partnership between DECD and CERC, known as the Partnership to Advance the Connecticut of Tomorrow, a new economic development delivery model for our state. His business development priorities included helping build our urban centers into engines of growth, further capitalizing on the state's top flight colleges and universities, strengthening the state's workforce pipelines, and marketing Connecticut as a place that is open for business. Prior to joining DECD, David worked in the financial services industry. Most recently, he was global head of real estate finance for the investment banking division of Goldman Sachs, where he worked for 15 years. Today's session will consist of a 20-minute presentation by David, followed by a 25-minute question and answer period. For those of you who submitted questions at registration, we will do our best to address these, as many of these as possible. Audience questions can also be submitted via the Q&A link throughout the presentation. Again, I'd like to welcome David and turn it over to him.
Great, Christina, thank you very much. And thanks everyone for having me on here tonight. It's a pleasure to be with this group, and I really appreciate the opportunity to speak. First off, and Christina, thank you for the bio there. I hadn't heard that in a while. As Christina mentioned, I do live in Greenwich. I've lived here with my wife and two kids since 2009, and I was in the private sector up until 2019. A lot of folks, when I got to Hartford, they assumed because Governor Lamont was from Greenwich and I was from Greenwich that we must know each other. We actually didn't know each other at all. So maybe just a quick anecdote as we get started. I was in the financial services sector for 20 years, 15 of which at Goldman Sachs in different roles. And when Governor Lamont was elected in 2018, I heard a lot of what he wanted to accomplish as it relates to the Connecticut economy. He's a former businessman. His wife, Annie, is an experienced and successful venture capitalist. He reminded me in many ways of Mike Bloomberg in a positive way. I was in New York City in 2001, 2002 when Mayor Bloomberg was elected, and Governor Lamont struck me in what was and still is arguably a divided political world of left and right as a pragmatist and a businessman and someone that wanted to govern from the center. And I didn't anticipate leaving Goldman Sachs to work in politics or public service at that point in time, but I actually cold called the governor. I cold called Garrett Moran, who some of you may know. Garrett was heading the governor's transition team. And I said, this is my resume. If I can be useful to the governor and what he wants to accomplish here in the state, I will quit my job and join the team. And after a number of conversations over the course of several weeks, a role was determined, which Christina mentioned. I served as his financial advisor as it relates to policy, so taxes, budget, pensions, other policy matters, and we'll talk about some of them. And then I oversaw the economic development team, which was 110 people in what's called the Department of Economic and Community Development, everything from business retention and attraction to brownfields redevelopment, tourism, marketing, branding, arts, culture, museums, a very, very broad portfolio. And it was a phenomenal experience. My last day was last month. So I served from February of 19 to January of 2023. And it was the most fulfilling job I've ever had and one of the hardest jobs I've ever had. And I really enjoyed it. And what I wanted to do today is that I'm going to speak as a private citizen here with the experience that I have. I used to speak for the governor in my role working for the governor, but I just want to Mirandize myself a little bit. I'm going to speak here of what we focused on, some of the accomplishments we had, and take you a bit into the mindset of how we're thinking about Connecticut and growing Connecticut's economy, and some of the experiences over the past 4 years. First off, I think before we talk about some of the accomplishments and some of the focus, I think we should level set on the state of the Connecticut economy. And there's a couple different ways that you can look at it. One of the first ways that we look at it is tax receipts. How are we doing in terms of income tax, sales tax, et cetera? And tax receipts actually have been quite strong for over 5 years at this point in time. So Connecticut will have its fifth consecutive surplus, where you have more revenues than expenses in the state. The state has not had that before. So we are in a fiscal situation that we've not been, a very positive fiscal situation that we've not been in the state of Connecticut ever. Now, that's not to say there's still not headwinds that we need to deal with, and I'll talk about those and how we got into this place initially. But you've had tremendous surpluses in aggregate over that 5-year period, approximately $10 billion of surplus. So where did all that money go? Roughly $6 billion of that has gone to pay down pensions. So the unfunded pension liability, which was created over roughly a 70-year period, over 3 generations, we can talk more about that in the Q&A perhaps. $6 billion pay down of that $40 billion unfunded pension liability, or roughly 15%. In addition to that debt pay down, which is quite significant and really hadn't been done before, and that was debt pay down beyond the annual payments that are required. The state currently has a $3.3 billion, what's called a rainy day fund, or the budget reserve fund, and that's roughly 15% of revenues. So there is a rainy day fund, if revenues do come in shorter or expenses are higher, as opposed to cutting services or raising taxes, the state has really a best-in-class rainy day fund if you look at other states and where you should be to weather an economic storm or recession or otherwise. So tremendous progress in terms of tax receipts relative to expenses. And I mentioned just maybe briefly here on pensions before we keep going on the economy, the $6 billion of pension pay down that happened, excess pension pay down, that'll actually save state taxpayers roughly $500 million per year for the next 25 years. So roughly $12 plus billion in savings because of that pay down, because we're amortizing the pensions faster than we previously thought. And it's anticipated that this upcoming year, there will be even more pension pay down because of the surplus. So there was a rule that was enacted in the bipartisan budget in 2017, where funds in excess of 15% in the budget reserve fund go to pay down debt. So that's hardwired in, and there's guardrails that are in place that have actually helped put the state on much firmer financial footing. The pensions I mentioned before, really from 1940 to 2010, the state of Connecticut had a defined benefit plan for teachers as well as state employees. And candidly, it was not funded. The pension plans were not funded. This is not a Democrat or a Republican thing. No one wanted to fund the pensions. Really, under Governor Malloy in 2010, the required payments started to be made that continued under Governor Lamont, in addition to those excess payments I mentioned before. And I've looked at the numbers pretty carefully on the pensions. I think it was the 800-pound gorilla, and I think still is in many ways in terms of the debt that Connecticut's racked up over those 3 generations. But I think it's a problem that we are addressing and will be amortized over the next 20 or so years. And I think it's something that is addressable, meaning I think within the current revenue construct, we can and will pay down our pensions, and we're not recreating this problem, which it was, my view of political expediency. We'll deal with that pension issue in the future. And that was said for too long, and that's not being said anymore, and it's being addressed. Another thing as it relates to the economy, and this, I think one of the questions that I saw from Christina was business starts. So one of the things we looked at on a pretty regular basis, and we oversaw a lot of attraction of businesses coming to the state, as well as businesses in Connecticut that chose to grow in the state of Connecticut. But business starts in the state of Connecticut are, and this is US Census data called high propensity business starts, so businesses that form in the state and intend to hire in certain categories like manufacturing, for example. That's running roughly 1,100 businesses per month. In pre-pandemic, gave you a sense it was around 800 per month. So you've seen a 30+% increase in business starts versus pre-pandemic levels. And we're actually starting new businesses in the state at the highest level since before the financial crisis. And this data really goes back about 20 years, a little less than 20 years, but we're at all-time highs. And the reason I reference the census business starts, because the state also tracks them, but the state's business starts can be businesses formed for purchasing real estate, for example, or other entities that aren't going to hire people. We really wanted to focus on businesses that are going to hire people. So if you look empirically, Connecticut has seen a big increase in entrepreneurial activity. The goal, and we'll talk about some of the initiatives that occurred, the goal is to continue to encourage businesses to start here and to stay here as they hire and grow. One of the other things we look at from an economic perspective is population growth. For a very long period of time, the Connecticut economy and the Connecticut population has been stagnant. And this, I think it's important to note, this is not a unique to Connecticut issue. The Northeast in general has had much lower population growth, much lower housing growth than parts of the South and West. And that's where a lot of the migration has been in the country. Excuse me. What you saw since 2019 is roughly a 35,000 increase in the state's population, which was around 1%. That is certainly not highest of all the 50 states, but it's a lot better than where we were, the state of Connecticut was actually losing population. And one of the things when you look underneath that population, when I thought about what parts of the state were really growing and driving the state economy, there are cities, and Stamford is the best example, that are unbelievably fast growing. So Stamford grew 11% from 2010 to 2020. That's actually higher than the city of Miami grew over that same 10-year period. So what you see in the state of Connecticut are places like Stamford, Danbury, New Haven, Shelton, and there's a handful of towns that enabled a lot of housing to be built, many times dense housing, and they saw their populations grow. But one of the great tensions, and I think one of the great questions we as a state need to address going forward is, if we want to grow and have a very dynamic economy, we need to enable more housing to be built in the state of Connecticut. And that's not, I think this has become this political issue, in my opinion, around quote unquote affordable housing. When I mean housing, I just mean all types of housing, because we're not going to see population growth and economic growth unless we enable more housing to be built. Certain towns, certain cities like Stamford, again, have done a great job of it. Other towns in the state have, in my opinion, resisted housing growth. So the question is, can more housing be built in a responsible way where we can keep having the dynamism in our economy that we all want as citizens and that employers and business builders want? So I'll talk more about that, but I think it's important to note parts of the state are growing incredibly fast. Other parts of the state haven't grown as fast. Lastly, as it relates to the current state of the economy, we tracked on a pretty regular basis job creation numbers, GDP numbers, personal income numbers. And on average, and it's very tough because some of these numbers come out monthly, some of them come out quarterly, and you see a lot of revisions in those numbers. But if you look at GDP, for example, gross domestic product at the state level, Connecticut was around the median. We were around 24th or 25th over the last 2 or 3 year period. Certainly, we don't strive for the middle, but if you look where Connecticut had been and versus some of our peers in the Northeast and Middle Atlantic area, that was a significant improvement. For the preceding 10 years, the state of Connecticut economy really did not grow very fast. And there were periods there where we were in that bottom quartile or that bottom 25% of economic growth. And it was really important that we boost that growth. And again, a lot of that is a function of the jobs you have in the state and the productivity of those jobs, as well as more people doing more things in the state of Connecticut. So you get back to this point on in-migration and housing. One last point before I go to some of the other things we focused on. The governor, and I know the State of the Union is tonight with President Biden, but the governor is going to be unveiling his budget tomorrow. And just to give you a sense, his view going into the second term is he's very focused on growth and the livability of Connecticut. So 2 of the things that he's unveiled already, and there'll be more details that'll come out tomorrow. One is a small business tax cut, or a cut in what's called the pass-through entity tax, making it more affordable for those that have businesses in the state set up as a pass-through entity to pay less tax to the state of Connecticut. And then a low and middle income tax cut, That was a mouthful. So roughly of the 1.7 million tax filers, the governor intends to cut taxes for 1.1 of those 1.7 million. And I think the average savings could be $300 to $600 per individual or per family per year. So this will go through the legislative process. There will certainly be discussion and debate, but the governor is very focused on some of the surplus, some of these benefits we've seen. Let's cut taxes. And that's actually not been done in the state of Connecticut really ever since the income tax came into play in a significant way. That tax cut, I think, will be roughly $500 million a year in savings just for the individual, in addition to the small business tax cut. So governor is very focused on growth and affordability in the state of Connecticut, which I think is really important. So let me talk a little bit about my time at the Department of Economic and Community Development and some of what we focused on. And I'm gonna try to hit the high points here and not bore or lose people on a Tuesday night. So first, one of the things we did, and this gets down to fiscally responsible, making sure that we're being smart with taxpayer money, is we did a full overhaul of business incentives. So the state of Connecticut and other states for a long period of time were giving lots of taxpayer dollars to businesses that were growing jobs or investing in the state. And other states do that. That's the market, if you will. But what we found, in my opinion, is that the state was actually giving out a lot of money, and some of this activity arguably would have been happening anyway in the state of Connecticut. So we reduced the incentives going out to certain businesses from the state for this job creation by over 70%, and that saved taxpayers $400 million. And we created a new structure that provided businesses with incentives to create jobs and to make investments in the state of Connecticut, but at a much lower cost and a much lower risk to taxpayers. We just thought that money could be better spent elsewhere or saved for that matter. The second thing that we did, and Christina alluded to this in the intro there, is we created something called Advanced Connecticut. In many other states, Florida, North Carolina, I know that came up in some of the questions, have 501c3s that are set up to advance the interests of the state and attract businesses to the state. So we created Advanced Connecticut. Actually, initially, Indra Newey, who's also a Greenwich resident and was chairman and CEO of Pepsi before she joined and co-chaired the board. We basically created an entity that was 50% funded by the state of Connecticut, 50% funded by the private sector, considerable private sector board membership and participation. The thought being, business is going to help beget more business in the state. It wasn't let's have government folks talking about businesses. Let's make sure we have business at the table, telling the story of why they like Connecticut, why they want to be in Connecticut. And Advanced Connecticut, it's 3 odd years old right now, but we touched over 60 businesses that decided to grow or come to the state of Connecticut and relocate to the state of Connecticut, and the creation of over 12,000 jobs over the next 5 years through Advanced CT. So a real success, and this is something that'll continue to grow and live beyond Governor Lamont, I hope. And this is the template and the framework that many other states use that are very successful as it relates to economic development and business recruitment. We want to make sure the private sector is at the table. That is a real framework of the governor's. Let's make sure that we have the experts there and we have the private sector at the table being part of the solution in everything that we do. The third thing I want to mention, and this, no one anticipated this, I certainly didn't going in, is COVID. And in February of 2020, March of 2020, everyone was responding to COVID. And I spent a lot of my time as it relates to businesses, whether they were staying open, whether we were adjusting how they do business. And listen, let me say one thing with the benefit of hindsight and COVID. I think we realized that whatever decisions were made with COVID, even when you had more information later on in 21, it became a politically divisive topic, whether something was open or not open, or there were other protocols in place. You knew that a third to half the population, whatever rationale there was for decision, was not going to agree with it. So I take that for what it is. But if you look objectively at how Connecticut navigated COVID relative to other states, we took, in my opinion, a centrist path, a path that really looked at outcomes and focused on, what is the cost versus the benefit. So I'll go through a couple examples. One, certainly if you look at states in this area, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut kept manufacturing open the whole time. Construction was open the whole time. All things around real estate, things like golf courses, which was outside. We wanted to make sure that those opportunities, state parks, were always available to folks. So we were certainly more lenient, you can use that word, relative to other states in the Northeast in terms of what was allowed. I realized there were states like Florida or Texas that were even more open than Connecticut at times, but we really tried to strike what we thought was the right balance based on the data we saw coming in. And we were very close to businesses. So restaurants, retailers, I mentioned manufacturers beforehand. Much of the dialogue that we had with businesses, and the strength of the dialogue, candidly, a lot of that started with COVID and how close we were with businesses. And there were times when, beyond the protocols and helping manage the businesses, there were grants and other assistance, zero interest loans, for example, that the state did, in addition to some of the federal funds that were out there. So, COVID management, I do think, with the benefit of hindsight, the path that we took was one that I still think was the right path. And we really wanted to make sure that we were, focused on enabling as much activity as possible, as safely as possible. But again, I realized that not everyone was pleased. Some people thought you were doing too much and others thought you were doing too little. So we tried to navigate the best we could. And I do think that many of the businesses that were out there, that really strengthened the relationship between the governor and those businesses. In addition to that, maybe a fourth thing is the relationship that we had with the business community. The governor and I would say 2 to 4 times a week. It really depended on the week, but we were meeting with businesses, and these were businesses that were here in the state. Some were contemplating coming to the state, some were growing, some weren't growing, but there was a continuous engagement with small businesses and with large businesses across the state. The governor himself is a businessman. He's an entrepreneur. His wife invests in a lot of businesses. He really wanted to be out there in front of businesses. So we reestablished that relationship, and I made sure his dance card was as full as possible with businesses and business visits, because we wanted to get the word out in terms of Connecticut being open for business, and a change in tone in terms of how he was thinking about the state and what we were doing in the state of Connecticut. Lastly, in terms of accomplishments, I talked a lot about DCD, but there was a fair amount of legislation. So we talked about some of the budgets that were done, a couple of which were done on a bipartisan basis led by the governor. But in addition, we made it easier to buy and sell commercial property in the state of Connecticut, eliminating something called the Transfer Act. We simplified the jobs creation incentive, as I mentioned before, making it lower cost and lower risk to taxpayers. We overhauled how the unemployment insurance fund works in the state of Connecticut, saving employers, in particular small employers, money as they were putting less money into the fund, and making it fair for a lot of small businesses. In addition, we enabled sports betting in the state of Connecticut and iGaming. So working with the 2 Native American tribes in the state, the Mashantucket Pequots and the Mohegans, to get our gaming into the 21st century. For them, very critical, as well as incremental revenue for the state of Connecticut and opportunities for Connecticut residents. Another thing which I think is worth noting here, some of the questions around business formation. Connecticut has what's called a capital base tax, which some other states have as well, but basically the state of Connecticut, there's a minimum tax imposed even if certain businesses aren't revenue positive. And we wanted to eliminate that tax. We want to incentivize businesses to grow and raise capital here and not tax them for it if they are pre-revenue or pre-profit. So that phase out was done. And then lastly, we worked very closely with manufacturers to enable apprenticeship tax credits. Workforce has long been a key strength of the state of Connecticut. And we want to make sure that in particular in things like finance, insurance, and manufacturing, and roughly finance and insurance, roughly 10% of the labor force, manufacturing, again, roughly 10% of the labor force in the state of Connecticut. We want to make sure that our significant employers and those that are growing businesses here have opportunities to bring workers on at a relatively inexpensive way to apprentice them and train them in the state of Connecticut. So those are 4 or 5 of the opportunities, of the things that we accomplish in the state, and as it relates to DECD, beyond some of the macro numbers in terms of the budget. So I want to touch on what I think are some of the tall trees, for lack of a better way to say it. And I think a lot of the questions that you all asked, some of them are related to this. So one of the questions was, what is the pitch to a CEO or to businesses coming to Connecticut? So we saw many businesses, in particular from New York, whether it was right before COVID or right after COVID, we saw a lot of businesses move. And I think many of the businesses, what they were focused on in Connecticut, there were many things, but education almost always came up in terms of the quality of the education, and that's K through 12. as well as the quality of the workforce. So the university system in the state of Connecticut, and how educated Connecticut grads are and the population here, really, really critical. Secondly, healthcare and quality of life. And again, that meant different things to different people, but that was a big part of our pitch, especially post-COVID. So, there was a time when everyone felt you needed to be in New York City or Boston or San Francisco. But what we saw post-COVID, and I gave you some of the numbers in Stanford, is small, vibrant cities like Stanford, like New Haven, were very attractive, and they were more affordable and more livable, especially coming out of COVID. So we really wanted to sell and really wanted to make investments in those cities, really, really critical for the state of Connecticut. And then lastly, and this goes back to the tax point up front, tax certainty is important to businesses in particular, as well as families. So the state of Connecticut, if you look back objectively over the past 20 years, we've not done a good job on tax certainty. And again, this is not a political point. 2 Democratic governors raised taxes, or raised twice by 1 Democratic governor, I should say, and Republican governors raised taxes twice in the state of Connecticut as it relates to the income tax, is just one example. But the governor, very much understood that, strong economies had great infrastructure. And I think we do have that, whether it's broadband in the state of Connecticut, whether it's Metro North, the New Haven line in particular. I understand things like 95 have a lot of traffic on them at times, but where we could move the needle, and I think there's still things we can do, especially as it relates to airports in the state of Connecticut. I'm not sure if anyone here has flown out of Tweed, but also we're focused on Sikorsky Airport in Bridgeport, and is there commercial service that can be done there? So infrastructure key, education very, very strong, and then tax certainty. And the governor is very focused on delivering that message, and I think that's what you're going to see from the governor in terms of the budget he unveils tomorrow. So that's really how we sold it. And what we found is when we were recruiting businesses, taxes and was part of the calculus, but I would say the vast majority of the calculus and the algorithm, and it depended on the business that was coming here, but they wanted to know about, could they get the workforce? Could they get the people they needed to be successful? And we have a very tight labor market in Connecticut. There's 100,000 jobs that are open, and there's roughly 50,000 people that are looking for those jobs. So you have a job openings to job workers ratio very consistent with what you're seeing in the country at large. So really critical that we continue to invest in our workforce. It's long been a strength of the state of Connecticut, but that really was the driving factor for businesses in terms of their location decision, based on what I saw in my time working for the governor. Maybe a point on this, and this will be a pivot to housing. So some might be familiar. There's a company that has one of their largest operations in Wilton called ASML. And ASML is a Dutch semiconductor equipment manufacturer, and they announced around 6 months ago a $200 million expansion and the hiring of 1,000 new people. And the pivot to housing here is when the governor and I spoke to ASML leadership and others, and this is just indicative of other conversations we had. I'm just using them as an example here. One of the first things that the people that are running ASML want to know are, am I going to be able to find the workers, and are my workers going to be able to find the housing? And this is where the housing and responsible growth conversation, I think, is so critical, because what ASML and other companies wanted from the government here, and I understand and appreciate local control and a lot of the issues around housing, but what was important to them is the certainty that they were going to get the people, and their people could live in a reasonable area around ASML. And those are the type of conversations we would have all the time when we're competing for business. So that's why it's so critical, in my opinion. We want to grow. We want to have a dynamic economy. I would run into people all the time. Why can't we be more like Florida? Well, the reality is states like Florida, they're growing and they're seeking that growth. It is easier to do real estate developments, do housing developments. And some of that, candidly, is a function of just more land, cheaper land in places like Florida. Connecticut's a very dense state, but that team attitude, that team Connecticut attitude on let's figure out a way to make this work, whether it's ASML or other employers, that is really, really critical. So I think when I think about the state's economy over the next 25 to 50 years, figuring out a way where we can responsibly grow housing and the population of the state of Connecticut, that's going to be the key to having a really dynamic economy for our kids and our grandkids, in the state. there are a couple questions about energy, and I understand Marissa Gillette spoke to many of you. So energy, in addition to housing, I think is probably one of the most important long-term things. So energy prices, not just in Connecticut, but in New England, are high. And the reason for that is getting hydrocarbons, natural gas in particular, to the region. It's coming from, for all intents and purposes, a single pipeline from Pennsylvania and through the state of New York. But ultimately, what you're seeing there is it's not adequate, and that is causing prices to be high, especially in times when, whether it's peak cold or peak hot, and that is a structural headwind that we have as a state as it relates to energy. So I'm not an energy expert, but when I dug in and spent time with the energy folks, and the governor did, ultimately the focus was let's control what we can control. We can debate whether we can or should create a new huge pipeline to bring natural gas to the state of Connecticut. I think that's quite unlikely for a variety of reasons. But the focus was, let's focus on nuclear. So the governor in his first year did a deal with Dominion Resources as it relates to their Millstone plant, which is a nuclear plant in Waterford in eastern Connecticut, where he was able to purchase a significant amount of generation output at roughly 5 cents per kilowatt hour. In addition to that, there's a big focus on renewables. So if you look at the New England grid, roughly, it's been 25% nuclear, 25% renewables, and 50% hydrocarbons. But I think the goal is let's continue to diversify away from the hydrocarbons, where could we have more nuclear, whether that's Millstone or otherwise. And what can we do in the renewables? There's a big focus on offshore wind. Solar is clearly prevalent and growing. But what can we do to kind of increase the mix of renewables and nuclear? And that is going to reduce the price volatility, especially as you see big gyrations in natural gas markets, not just in the US, but across the world. So I think that is the strategy, is to continue to invest nuclear, renewables, and have a diversified basket where there is certainty in terms of prices. There still will be very low cost generators, especially if they're going to burn hydrocarbons and natural gas in other parts of the country. But what we found with most businesses is they really want the certainty, understandably, of their energy price. And if you look at the cost of goods sold and how much the energy component is, yes, you want it lower. But when I think about where we compete and where Connecticut competes, we're typically competing for very high value add manufacturing or other energy intensive businesses. So I think we're going to continue to compete there as opposed to the commoditized parts of the market. And I think if we can provide certainty with a competitive cost of energy, I think that is the right strategy. And I think that you'll see the governor continue to focus on how can we diversify to mitigate that price risk while still offering a competitive energy price to our businesses and to our residents. Two last things, one, and I'm not going to go through it here in detail, but we did a lot of analysis and created what was called the Economic Action Plan, and a lot of that focus was on, workforce, as I had mentioned before, but also livability of our cities. So we want to make sure that our small cities, especially where we feel like there's significant economic growth and opportunity, and to me, it feels like that's the Stamford to New Haven corridor, the Greenwich to New Haven corridor, is going to be a key economic driver for the state of Connecticut for the next 25 years or so. But we want to make sure that we're investing in those communities. So that's education, that's housing, it's other developments where the vibrancy and the livability of the community can be increased. So we ran a couple programs focused on that. A lot of focus on workforce that I mentioned. And then the focus was on small business. How can we work as a government with the private sector on loan programs focused on enabling small businesses to grow in the state of Connecticut? And that'll continue to be focused. Another Greenwich resident is a gentleman by the name of Matt McCooey. I'm not sure if anyone knows Matt here, but Matt is the CEO of Connecticut Innovations, which is actually a $500 million AUM private equity, venture firm that invests in Connecticut high growth businesses. And that's truly unique to Connecticut. They've got a great track record. I was privileged enough to serve as vice chair in my role for the governor on Connecticut Innovations Board. But things like that, we want to keep investing in high growth, high productivity, high value add industries. And that's how Connecticut has competed, and I think how we will compete in the future. Last thing I want to mention here, and then I'm happy to pivot to questions. A number of questions came in on how can Connecticut compete with quote unquote low tax states, right? I looked at a lot of the migration data. I'm sure we all know people that have left and taken up residence in a different state, and obviously that's not a zero-sum game, right? What were taxes to Connecticut are not taxes in many instances to Florida or Texas. What I think the important strategy here and how we wanted to differentiate ourselves, how the governor wanted to differentiate ourselves is, for families, individuals, others that wanted to be in this region for work, for healthcare, for education, for the quality of life, for the Four Seasons, where there's many benefits, in my opinion, of living in a place like Greenwich or a state like Connecticut. We realize that's not going to be for everyone, but we wanted to make sure that we have a tax structure that works. And, I looked a lot at our tax rates relative to other states, neighboring states. And, what you actually saw places like Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York increase their tax rates over the past 4 years. And the governor was very, very vocal on, we don't need more taxes. We don't need increased taxes. We want more taxpayers. We want to grow the population. We want to grow the labor force. So this gets back to this point of we want to provide tax certainty. And I think that served the state of Connecticut very well for a very long time. I think for many reasons that was not the case for 10 or 20 years there, but I think we have our footing again. You're seeing that in the numbers. I think having a businessman in the governor's office is really critical to get that message out. And I think what I would ask everyone here is if we all kind of speak from the same hymnal in terms of what we're seeing in Connecticut and some of the changes we're seeing in Connecticut, I actually think that goes a long way, because the negativity that I used to hear, and I hear less of it myself these days, but I think that was self-destructive. And I think if you're objective and look at the facts on the ground, there's still work to do, but the picture is much, much brighter than I think it was 5 or 6 years ago. So I'm going to stop there. I'm looking at myself in a black screen. So Christine, I'm not sure if I've lost everyone, but happy to go to other questions that you may have.
No, you're good. Everyone's sticking with you. David, that was amazing. You really hit on a lot of the questions that had come in at registration. So
actually, I'm sorry, Christine, pardon me for interrupting, but one question, just looking at my notes here. There were a number of questions, and one of the things I think is the biggest opportunity is this hybrid or remote work environment. And we saw significant migration into Connecticut from COVID, not just New York, but also New Jersey, Massachusetts, California, even Washington, D.C. But remote work, and the best way to think about it is if you used to need to be in Manhattan 5 days a week, maybe you didn't want to live in Ridgefield or Danbury or Trumbull for that matter. But if you need to be in New York 2 or 3 days a week now, maybe you're willing to do that. And you want the lifestyle and the education and the healthcare, the livability of Connecticut more broadly. I think that I think there's a structural change in terms of how work's being done for many businesses, not for all of them. And remote work, places like Connecticut and the suburbs, there's actually an article in Bloomberg today on the suburbs of New York. You're still seeing a very, very tight housing market. I think what you're seeing is places like Connecticut are going to be benefiting and have benefited. But the more I think a hybrid work environment happens, that's really great for our cities and small towns. It's also great from a tax revenue perspective. And there's some complications there on how intrastate tax works. But I think that really is a boon to Connecticut, and something that the governor, certainly when I was there, we were very focused on telling the story. How do we market the state? How do we brand ourselves and make sure that the flow of residents continues and people choose Connecticut versus other options?
Great. Okay, well, I will open it up to questions from the audience, and I see we're already getting some coming in. So I will just go ahead and give this to you, David. Does Connecticut look to attract certain types of businesses to the state?
Yes. There were 6 or 7 core industries where we felt we had a competitive advantage, right? Because I mentioned before, we're not the low. I think we need to be honest with ourselves. We wanted to be the high value add, high touch, high from a perspective of, is it going to be commoditized labor or really reliant on very, very low energy prices? That's not where we historically have excelled. And I think we want to focus, especially when you think Connecticut still has some of the highest incomes in the 50 states. So what does that mean? So financial services in particular. So banking, insurance, investment management, long been strong parts of Connecticut's economy and will continue to be, in my opinion. Manufacturing, in particular, aerospace and defense is a huge part of the Connecticut economy and the various supply chains of aerospace and defense. So, Raytheon Technologies has Pratt & Whitney and Collins Aerospace. You have General Dynamics Electric Boat, which makes nuclear submarines in Groton, New London. And then you have Sikorsky here in Stratford, as just to name a few of those. So those are very, very big industries. Healthcare more broadly is a growth area. Pharma and biotech in particular. New Haven and Yale just do a phenomenal job in terms of patent activity in intellectual technology. There was also a focus on renewables and other technologies from an energy perspective that we thought could be game changing for the state of Connecticut and beyond. So the theme is, where we have an edge in terms of universities, workforce, or existing supply lines, we really look to work with those businesses to help recruit more businesses in the state. And I think that's a strategy that has worked, and we should continue to focus, because I think being all things to all people is not a winning strategy.
Connecticut is bifurcated in terms of territorial wealth between Southwest and Northeast. Population density, per capita income, price of housing, et cetera. How can the state decrease that gap?
Yeah, it's challenging, and this gets to this question of what can we control, and let's focus on controlling what we can control. So you have wealth inequality in the state of Connecticut, like you have in New York and many other states. And some of that, the way that I looked at some of those numbers, is we just happen to have more wealthy people, or a higher proportion of wealthy people in the state of Connecticut. So I think we need to acknowledge that first and foremost, as opposed to because other states, they may not have the gap, but they may just not have the wealthy people. So I think we need to be careful. We need wealthy people here. We want wealthy people here. They do pay in our progressive tax system a significant portion of the income tax, which really is the main driver of the state. Outside of that, there are initiatives in terms of how towns get funding from the state and what's referred to as pilot, places like New Haven and others, how education cost formula is shared in the state. So I'm getting a bit into the weeds. So there are tools that the state budget has to try to equalize, might not be the right word, but to try to level the playing field where there is some control. But I think what I saw in some of this is people may want to live in Greenwich or Westport for whatever reason. And I think we need to keep welcoming those folks into the state. And we need to be careful not to send folks like that to Florida that have means and are going to pay a lot of disproportionate amounts of income tax and other taxes in the state.
This is a question about state troopers. Connecticut is below the mandate for state troopers. Currently, many are overworked. What's Connecticut's strategy to fill that quota?
Yeah, so we're definitely getting out of my swim lane with the state troopers, but the governor has been focused, and police recruitment has been challenging here in the state of Connecticut, as well as other states, for many reasons that I'm sure many on this call are aware of. So I think the best thing we can do is continue to make that a priority, to prioritize people coming in and have a diverse, importantly, incoming class, a representative class in the state police force that looks like the state of Connecticut. And it has been a focus of the governor. So I think just getting the numbers up, it's going to take some time and persistence. And ultimately there perhaps are other dials as it relates to salary and whatnot, but we need to make sure that we have a great police force. And I'm sure folks have looked at the numbers, but the overall statistics in terms of how safe the state of Connecticut is are off the charts good. I mean, we as a state are very, very low crime, very, very high quality livability ratings.
Can you please discuss the rent control bill introduced by Senator Winfield? What are the ramifications for economic growth in the state of Connecticut if this is passed?
I'm not aware of that bill. So for the past four weeks, I've been in the private sector. I'm not necessarily familiar with that bill, but let me just say one comment about bills in Hartford, maybe. And I understand you guys do some work with the legislative delegation from Greenwich. A lot of bills are proposed. A very, very small fraction of the bills proposed will ultimately get debated to committee or pass committee, and then potentially to the floor and then the governor's desk. So, my advice, if there are bills that you like or don't like, is be very vocal with the Greenwich delegation as it relates to your view on these bills or questions about these bills. but I dealt with, and I didn't appreciate this when I was in the private sector before I worked for the governor. I would get screaming phone calls, hey, this is a travesty. And the reality is some of these bills just don't go anywhere. Some do, but I just think the best thing you can do is be vocal and get a sense of, is this potentially going to move? But anything that limits housing development, I personally think we need to be really, really careful, because we do not want to dissuade anyone from building housing in the state of Connecticut. That would be a mistake.
Okay. You touched a lot on Connecticut having these great schools and, putting out this really strong workforce. How have you improved connections between businesses and technical high schools, colleges, universities? Are we graduating students with the skills that Connecticut businesses are looking for?
Yeah, so it's, and I'll give you some numbers here. So this was a huge focus, and this is part of the economic action plan I mentioned. So one thing the governor did in 2019 was create the Governor's Workforce Council. So we looked at states like Colorado, for example, and Maryland, I think, has one as well. How did they successfully tackle workforce? How do you create a stickiness between high school, technical, and college grads, for that matter, so they stay in the state of Connecticut? They work very closely with your employers, and this council basically had the private sector. It was led by the private sector, so it wasn't government or educators saying, hey, this is what we think you need. It was the private sector telling the government and the technical schools, hey, this is what we need. So we started that council in 2019, and there have been many programs that have come out of it, in addition to significant funding for workforce. So I think there's over $200 million between federal and state funding to upskill and reskill Connecticut residents. COVID actually had a big impact in certain skills, and people we're just not as relevant in their skills. The jobs weren't as in demand as they were pre-COVID, perhaps. And so what we saw is, another initiative was called Career Connect, where we had employers signing up to basically be engaged and create the stickiness for internships with local colleges. So it really gets down to ground game and grassroots. How can you make sure that employers have a vested interest in the technical schools and the universities, and vice versa? And the infrastructure to make sure that's happening is in place right now. So we'll track it. But what we saw coming in 2019 was, I think the data was roughly 70 to 80% of UConn graduates are in the state 12 months after graduation, but at a place like Yale, roughly 10% of the graduates were staying in state. So we need to get that Yale number where it's 50, 60, 70%. I do think there's a lot of upside there. I mean, candidly, I'm not sure how much worse it could have gotten, but I think there's a lot of upside there. And I think you're going to see that, especially with places like Stanford and New Haven continuing to be some of the drivers of Connecticut's population and economic growth.
Talking about the senior population, there's questions about sort of how do you prepare the healthcare costs for the rising, growing senior population? What is the current estate tax, and what are the plans for raising the estate tax limit to encourage more seniors to stay in Connecticut?
Yeah, so a lot of work's been done on this. So a couple of things. One, the tax cuts that were done last year. So not the tax cuts I mentioned that will ideally be in the budget for this year and the next year, but pensions and annuities tax was eliminated, and that was accelerated. So, if you're on a fixed income and you have a pension or annuity, you're not going to be paying income tax, and you would have done that 2 or 3 years ago. So reducing the cost for seniors that are on those fixed incomes. As it relates to the estate tax, Connecticut really since 2017, and actually just got to the federal level this year, but there was a step up to the federal level of where the estate and inheritance tax comes into play. So it's now at the federal level, which I want to say for a married couple is 24 million, or it's a very high number. So we still have an estate tax, and that generates roughly $200 million per year, but it's at the same, you're only paying Connecticut if you're paying the federal government. And those are significant estates. We can get into a whole discussion from a game theory perspective on, should you get rid of it? Do you make more money in income tax if you give up the estate tax? We looked at a lot of the numbers there. I personally think the step up to the federal level is a huge step. in terms of what the state of Connecticut has done for very wealthy seniors to stay here, in addition to what I mentioned for others, and elimination of the income tax. So the message, hopefully it's getting out there. We want it to get out more. We want people to stay with their children and grandchildren in the state of Connecticut and not leave the state of Connecticut.
Is there a town in Connecticut that's shown leadership in attracting businesses and citizens with the optimal combination of housing, schools, experience parks, and taxes to attract businesses and their employees?
I mean, yes, but I'm not partially. I mean, Stamford, again, I reeled off 4 or 5. If you look at housing starts that have been huge growers. So I mentioned Stamford by far has been the fastest grower at 11%. But if you look at New Haven, I think that was the 3rd fastest growing city in the state over the past decade at roughly 6 or 7%. But I also mentioned Danbury, and again, I'm sure many of folks here spend some time in Danbury, but really dynamic city, one of the other fastest growing cities in the state, Norwalk, Shelton. But if I'm to pick one, that really has done a great job, it's Stamford. And I've lived in I came to Connecticut the old fashioned way. I married a Connecticut girl. I was smart enough to do that, but I moved here in 2009, and I just think about the changes in Stamford since 2009. And that was further, the silver lining of COVID is you saw even more people moving in and businesses moving into Stamford. And I just think we're finally there in terms of Stamford. And I think it can and will get better. And for those that haven't had a chance to interact with Mayor Simmons, she is really great. And I think really strikes the right balance. So, Stamford and New Haven, I think, are the big growers of the state over the next 10 years. And I think you're going to see places like Danbury and Norwalk continue to grow too. But I think that's what we need to harness more of.
Fantastic. We have another question about energy. Energy costs were highlighted. What more specific strategies for deep energy cost reduction in terms of government programs, credits, et cetera, are most effective? How does the state pick the energy mix, define clean energy, and expect to reach its energy 2040 goal?
Yeah, so the 2040 goal there, for those that sounds like someone's very familiar with it, the goal is net neutral at 2040. And I think there's lots of things that go into that, and I personally think nuclear is some folks don't count it as a renewable, others do. Obviously the fuel from nuclear needs to be maintained for indefinitely, basically. But I do think nuclear, in terms of cost efficient, it makes a lot of sense. And I think what you saw from Governor Lamont in the Dominion deal back in 2019 is nuclear it's actually saved Connecticut ratepayers a lot of money. So I think 2040, I think, is doable. I think there's risk to that, though, now more so than I certainly thought 5 years ago. But the investments in offshore wind, and I think this is really what it comes down to, is you need, from an energy perspective, offshore wind, you need lots of different options, because from a baseload perspective, you can't have a grid when the wind is not blowing, that all of a sudden the grid's not there. So you need this diversification in renewables plus a big nuclear. And I think there was one question, Christina, that I saw about, can there be small nuclear, or small other distributed generation, what the energy folks would call it. And I think all of that stuff needs to be on the table. If it's of real interest to this group, Katie Dykes is the Commissioner of Energy and Environment. She could be an excellent speaker. She works very closely with Marissa. I'm not sure if Marissa addressed a lot of the stuff, but I think everything needs to be on the table, because I think we've got 15 or 20 years to get there. But I think significant investments need to be made, and a lot of the infrastructure money that's coming from the feds, I think, is going to be earmarked and focused on this. But a lot of work to do. I don't want to minimize it. But I think it really is going to come down to this diversification strategy with renewables and nuclear.
Is the state working with employers to help provide affordable housing for their workers?
So I'm not sure exactly how to interpret that question. The state has rules and laws, many of which are divisive, like the 830G law, which we can kind of get into here. But ultimately, there's not a state affordable housing program for employers. So in my ASML example, ultimately we're relying on the private market and the localities with some of the incentives. So there's low income housing tax credits and other carrots, if you will, as opposed to sticks that but they're focused on the individual. I think what most of these employers want is not capital A affordable housing. They want workforce housing. They want to know if they're hiring workers that are making $70, $80, $90,000, pick a number, that they're going to be able to find housing within a 5, 10, 15-mile radius that is of good quality. And that is the challenge, is how can in a very densely populated state, and there's NIMBY concerns that folks have, and I don't want to minimize it, but I think we need to be realistic. We can't say we want to grow, we want a great economy, and at the same time say, no, we can't build any more housing here. States that are growing and have dynamic economies are growing more housing. We can't kid ourselves in that. So we got to make a decision here. What do we want to be, and what do we want to do as a state? So I think the governor is very focused on this, and you will hear more. How can we, what are other carrots that we can put out there to encourage responsible development around train stations and other areas where, we want to build up density ideally.
Okay, our last question for the evening is, and this one's sort of tooting your horn a little bit. How will the good work you've done continue through Ned's second term, and who will lead? Yeah,
so I'm, as you guys may have heard, I'm a huge fan of the governor, and everything I thought in 2019 when I cold called him was true. I mean, just very genuine, incredibly smart, and he's focused on data and outcomes. He's, ideology is not his thing. So who's going to lead? So the governor is there, and I think that's critical. And, I think you're seeing candidly a governor that is more confident, has more experience now, and things around the tax cuts that I mentioned. I think that's all really great. And I think that's going to help rebrand Connecticut candidly. In terms of my seat, so a woman named Alexandra Dom, who was 3 years my right hand, incredibly smart, Harvard Business School. The governor appointed her to be commissioner of the Department of Economic and Community Development. So she's been in that role for 4 weeks right now. But the goal is to keep running the same plays and use the same playbook, to use a sports analogy that we have been doing. So Alexandra's phenomenal. Hopefully, maybe perhaps we could do, Christine, if it works for you and the team here, maybe we get Alexandra back on in 12 or 24 months and do a bit of an update, and you can see it firsthand. But she's awesome, and there's a lot of continuity between her and me, given we worked together for a long time.
That's awesome. Well, David, thank you so much. We're getting thank yous in the chats as well. This was incredibly informative, and we're really pleased to have you join us.
Thank you guys for having me. I did this a lot for 4 years, and now it's been a month. So forgive me if I was a little rusty, but it was a pleasure being here, and I really do appreciate the opportunity.
No, and I want to wish you the best of luck in whatever your new endeavor will be. I look forward to finding out what that is. Awesome. So thank you all for joining us. And on behalf of the League of Women Voters of Greenwich, we were just so happy that we could be here and learn a little bit more about what's going on in our state. So everyone have a wonderful evening.